Welcome to the RJLT Economics. Today I want to talk about whether the Europeans are correct in fearing Russia. And the short answer is that they are both wrong and right. Indeed, a more detailed answer is that they are fearing Russia for the very wrong reasons that by acting on that fear, they may actually induce what they should really fear about Russia, but they are actually not. Perhaps that is not a very clear statement, but I will explain this in today's podcast, and I hope that by the end of it, I will somewhat make it clearer, and I hope some of my listeners will find this an interesting and provoking thought. So first, let's talk about what the Europeans are mostly fearing from Russia when it comes to Russia. And I think it's two levels of virtually the same thing. More directly, the Europeans are afraid of a military or some sort of military invasion of Russia. But perhaps more commonly, they are fearing some sort of influence, Russian influence, particularly in the Central and Eastern European nations, that could then drive European policy and change how the Europeans can lead their lives. I think this type of fear is completely unfounded for three very simple reasons. Namely, that Russia lacks the population, the industrial capacity, and the internal cohesion to formulate, to start any sort of military invasion or an influence campaign. For military invasion is very easy to understand. Russia simply lacks the number of manpower, the amount of manpower and industrial output, military or otherwise, to sustain any war. But more importantly, its population is not chauvinistic. It's not as nationalist or proud as some of the Russophiles want you to believe. Because you see, I also listen to a lot of podcasts or perhaps discussions by a lot of people who are decidedly pro-Russia. It's perfectly fine, and I find some of their thoughts quite interesting and provoking. But at the same time, I think not everyone is trying to hide their preference or let's say Russophilia, in the sense that they paint this picture that I know to be false, which is that the Russians are such proud people, that they are such that they love their country, that they want to, that everyone is ready to give their lives, their livelihood in support of Mother Russia. That I know it's not true. I know most people either don't care about the political system or they prefer a more democratic, more liberal system. Even though that more democratic, liberal system may not be found in the West, that does not mean that they are perfectly satisfied with their current system. I know this because I come from another country that is somewhat similar to Russia in a lot of areas, but of course decidedly different in many others. But what I see is that in this type of developing countries, there are a lot of problems, social and political problems and economic problems that people want to have resolved. They long for something that is better. Doesn't mean that everyone is ready to betray their country, to sell it out, to sell out their friends and their colleagues, but people are not all ready to go to war simply because they are chauvinistic. And I know the Russians are, for the most part, not chauvinist, not nationalist. So they are not going to actually approve any government, Putin or otherwise, that wants to launch a military invasion of mainland Europe. That's not going to happen. But more importantly, even when it comes to Russian influence, political, economic, and social, cultural as well, I think empirical evidence suggests to the contrary, right? It's not like Russia is gaining influence in Europe. Rather, Russian influence has been receding since the 90s. We see that Russia completely retreated from the Warsaw Pact countries, and the Russian influence not completely, but more or less collapsed in Ukraine. And I think on the European side, Russia has very little influence outside of Belarus. I mean, very little influence in among its the former constituent nations of the Soviet Union, right? So Russia is not actually experiencing an improvement or enlargement of its influence, whatever kind we are talking about. So why should there be any fear that Russia is going to actually turn around and start to impose influence on a lot of nations that can threaten Europe? That's not actually happening. So having talked about this part, let's talk about what the Europeans should actually fear about Russia. And I think what they should really fear when it comes to Russia is not a prosperous Russia. They should fear a destabilized Russia, a Russia that is perhaps disintegrated, because Russia is a country with over 100 ethnicities, and it is a country with a lot of different religions, people with a lot of different practices, and it's very large, it's sparsely populated, so it's actually very difficult to govern successfully. It's very difficult for any government to have good control, especially of the more remote areas or areas occupied or not occupied, but where mostly minorities live. So if Russia becomes destabilized and Russian economy collapses, it's going to export not just refugees into Europe, but also violence, crime, drugs, obviously, but also weapons, including weapons of mass destruction, which Russia has abundance of. And this is not going to be actually very pleasing. And I know that I talked about this before, and I know a lot of other people have talked about this, which is that part of the reason why a lot of the European politicians are so on board with the initiative in Ukraine is with the hope that they will be able to carve up the spoils of war when Russia collapses, and they want to carve up Russia so to have a advantaged access to its natural resources. Those are very good thinking, but perhaps not realistic ones, because yes, when Russia Russia become disintegrated, the Americans will be able to exploit its natural resources at a very advantageous rate. And because the United States is separated from Europe and Asia, essentially separated from Russia by oceans, it's not going to suffer as much and the destabilizing effects. Well, Europe is really at the front doors. So if Russia became destabilized or disintegrated, the Europeans are the ones who will bear the price. It's pretty much similar to what happened in North Africa and the Middle East. The Europeans will be the ones that foot the bills. Well, they may not be the ones who actually will be able to collect the spoils. So that's the second point I want to make. Well, the third point is that by acting on the fears of Russia that they hold, which I believe is misplaced, they are inducing or perhaps increasing the likelihood that there is going to be destabilization in Russia, because if the conflict in Ukraine gets prolonged, I see three possible outcomes, right? I think these three outcomes are bad, worse, and worst. The bad outcome is that there is destabilized Ukraine. I think Ukraine, as it stands, is most likely going to be destabilized to at least the middle of this century. It is not, I don't see any possibility for Ukraine to become a stable, prosperous country within the next few decades. And if this war drags on, it's simply going to get worse and it's going to spread. And what this means is that when you have a very in terms of by European standards, it's a large country, and it's a very important exporter of grains, and it's a very important transit state of Russian natural resources to Europe. So with this region destabilized, what the Europeans will experience will be a continued higher prices in food and raw materials, and that is going to drag down further European competitiveness, even if the aftermath of this conflict is contained within Ukraine. That's the bad outcome. But a worse outcome would be the contagion spreading to either the European Union or Russia. If it spreads to the European Union, probably that would mean that Russia is eventually successful, but in their military, successful in double quotes. And the Europeans will be unsuccessful in containing the effects of the war, and this means that perhaps there will be disintegration of Europe. And I already predicted that the euro could be gone within just a few years. With the euro gone, with the European Union destabilized, with perhaps a few of the European Union member states dragged into the war, directly or indirectly. In fact, we can already say that some countries are already indirectly dragged into the war, as a lot of their soldiers are already on the ground, and as the number of casualties of these let's say volunteers military volunteers go up, and as the material commitment continue to increase, this is going to put social and economic pressure on that nation, and it's going to cause basically stagnating economy, stagnating social and human development, and essentially, to put it straightforwardly, the country will become poor, and poverty is the hotbed for crimes, for corruption. We're going to see very difficult and perhaps quite different Europe going forward. Perhaps mostly I'm talking about Central and Eastern Europeans, but it's not a very large continent. When the Eastern Europeans suffer, the Western Europeans are somewhat impacted as well. Another possibility for a worse outcome is that the Europeans somehow succeed. I'm not going to suggest how and in what time frame, but they may be successful. Let's not rule out this completely. They may be successful in holding their economy together, where at the same time it's possible that Russia, being perhaps against the full might of the European Union plus the Five Eyes, it's possible that the Russians will see their economy eventually collapse, and if that happens, what will then take place is that Russia will be destabilized, and all that I mentioned earlier could again impact Europe. So Europe is not going to be insulated from this one way or the other. In either way, it's not going to help. And this is not so far-fetched because even though the Russians have proven that their economy is much stronger than we thought of before, the events of the last few days with the Prigozhin saga, it also has shown us that the military and the political systems in Russia are not such well-oiled machines as a lot of the Russophiles would like us to believe. There are a lot of internal frictions within Russia, and I think this is quite understandable because we must admit, I would disagree. I cannot be convinced unless shown otherwise. That I can't believe people saying that Russia is a country free of corruption. I think Russia is a country that's plagued by corruption and ineffective government, bureaucracy, and people are not so satisfied all the time in this environment. And then there's of course very high degrees of income inequality, and I guess there's also a lot of problems with social mobility now, because during the Soviet Union social mobility was very high, but now I guess it's getting worse and worse. So there's going to be some there are some internal grievances, and when there is this war going on, and when this war goes on for a long period of time, it is natural that the social psyche of the entire nation becomes more tense, right? And this is when existing internal frictions become more come to the fore, right? Perhaps it was simmering beneath the surface, but now it become, and I think increasingly, people who disagree with a lot of the things, the way things are done in Russia, they may actually express themselves, and that is a destabilizing factor. So let's not just say that because Russia is militarily doing okay in the Ukraine conflict, because Russian economy has so far been holding strong, this does not mean that Russia is never going to experience problems. And I think as this war goes on, it's going to not be better. It's going to be worse. There will be more crises that will take place in Russia. And if anyone who actually doubts this, well, I guess history will prove whether I'm correct in this, because no economy, no society can sustain prolonged wars. And this is also part of the reason why the Americans, being separated by two oceans, want to drag this war on. It's really to bleed Russia and to bleed the Europeans. The worst case is Ukraine, Europe, and Russia all become destabilized, all become militarized, and that would be, I think, the worst scenario, and that is a very likely scenario for World War III. Now, I know a lot of people have been suggesting that there could be a military conflict in the Western Pacific, or in Southeast Asia. I also think that this is quite possible. We can't rule it out, even though that is something that we can see, right? It's something that we can foresee, and so it's not something that we should be so fearful of. What we should really be fearful of is something that we don't see. And very few people are saying that in Ukraine this conflict can actually spoil over, and the contagion can go to Europe and Russia. The whole entire continent can become destabilized, and that would turn or degrade into World War III. Very few people are talking about this, and it's something that we don't know. And I think we should pay more attention to this scenario. Europe gave the world 2 world wars in the last century. It would be quite befitting if they give us a 3-peat. And throughout the history of Europe, peace is a rare commodity. It is an aberration, and it is possible. It is quite possible, even though I still think it is not probable. Meaning that is probably less than a third, 1 to 2. The odds is less than that, but it's a possibility, and we should. I think European people and European politicians should really think this through, right? They may disagree with a lot of the things that Russia does. They may disagree with a lot of, perhaps even the cultural practices of a lot of Russians, who knows? But they should just cool it down, give Russia some room, make room for peace, just as, a lot of the more responsible leaders have suggested. And I think very interesting one among them is Donald Trump. How can Donald Trump be among one of the more responsible ones? But he is the ones pushing for peace. And I think this actually does not mean that Trump is so reasonable, so responsible. But on the other hand, what it really shows is the irresponsibility, the recklessness, the fanaticism of all the new conservatives in the United States and in Europe. Those people are pushing for a conflict that can devastate the entire continent and perhaps impact the lives of billions of people outside of Europe. This is so reckless, so irresponsible. I guess the only good thing that they know is that if this all goes wrong, they won't be remembered as the ones that caused this, because by that time, everyone and all human records will be lost, and they won't be remembered in any sense at all. All right, that's what I have to say today. This is actually the second time I make this recording, because yesterday I did one. 2 days ago, actually, I did one, but that time I missed a few points that I wanted to make and started a bit of a digression. So I decided that instead of publishing that one, I would make a new recording. So here it is. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.